ideas and words have a polemical meaning. They have a concrete opposition in view. They are tied to a concrete situation. For Schmidt, and even more for Leo Strauss in his commentary on Schmidt, the ability to differ with others over core beliefs, the power to discern those different from oneself, so that the enemy is clearly perceived as an enemy, is what constitutes not just politics, but the essence of being human. Schmidt's arguments suggest the dialogic nature of political statements, and how the constitution of the religious and of the political comes from a fundamental orientation toward another through which the self and the group may be constituted. This is an insight shared in a very different work of Wilfred Cantwell Smith and his attack on the idea of religion as a thing or a system, rather than overlapping sets of practices. Smith argues that most of the names we have for religions, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, were first coined by enemies seeking to systematize a religion in order to repudiate it, again suggesting a foundational other orientation to the constitution of ideas of religion and specific religions themselves. But Schmidt, Strauss, and Smith do not place attention on the communicative act itself, whereby these statements are made and made manifest for people. The theological political is constituted by the identification of the enemy, but it therefore depends on the political community's representation of others and itself. It is about the communication of that message through an architecture of circulation and representation. If we take into account the aesthetic and infrastructural nature of that form into account, how does this influence the construction of politics and religion? Raising this question is not just an issue of content, as I said before, the nature of the representation through which the enemy is identified, it is also one of form. It returns to the question of how the materiality of media create the technical infrastructure for the possibility of thought and experience, what Kittler would see as media's role in constituting the historical a priori of religion, politics, and experience. By bringing media theory into an analysis of the form of religion and the form of politics, we can understand the role of mediation in both constituting and threatening religious movements and religious totality. Didat's mimesis of Christian evangelical styles, his adoption of secular rational critique, his muted reference to Islamic forms of reasoning, and Swaggart's switching from evidence, from human agency and the power of rational argument, to the divine eruption of miracle, all constitute diverse cultural modes whereby religious publics are constituted and undermined. It is the role of mediation and circulation then in this constitution of religious movements that I'm interested in, and it's one part of how we might think of this relationship between religion and media and the role of materiality in it. And the sort of second more, what's the word? Diffuse. I have a couple of examples here when I get through. But another example of this I want to explore is to give an example from my research in Nigeria of a moment in the 1950s when the Quran was banned from being read over the radio. So prior to this moment, when radio diffusion was introduced into northern Nigeria in the 1940s, the issue emerged over whether it was permissible to broadcast the Quran or not. Like oral recitation, written calligraphy, or print, radio diffusion and radio broadcast take a divine text and re-signify it into a particular material form. This is a movement across media platforms and over space to new communities of listeners. As is often the case, the act of circulation refigures that which is being trafficked. To be made exchangeable, the object has to undergo transformation, become something that seems similar yet is qualitatively different. In this case, it turns the Quran into waves that pass through the air and then into pulses that move through cables before being reassembled into sound. Sound is no longer framed in a particular oral space, long configured by the sonic rhythms of live recitation, but dispersed, scattered into new arenas, affecting the listeners who inhabit. Radio diffusion was the wiring of signals to individual boxes, so it's a bit like cable today. It was the way radio was introduced and television in England in that sense. So you would not broadcast, you would broadcast it to a city, which would then take that broadcast and then relay it via cable to individual radios, which are effectively just loudspeakers that you turn on and off. It's a great way to control what people listen to colonial regime. In colonial Nigeria, this was the manner in which radio was broadcast. The signal was sent to a receiving station and then wide individual. The advantage with this is that receiving sets could not be tuned, and that the colonial broadcast was the only service possible. Because most Africans could not afford the cost of rental, however, because you had to subscribe to these boxes in the way that we subscribe to cable. And so most of the people who were doing that were Syrians, Lebanese, and expatriates. Africans couldn't really afford it except for very elite Africans. So because of it, the British nailed up these outside prominent places on the urban area. Outside the Emir's office, outside the post office, various places around town. So for most people, the experience of radio is a public communal activity taking place at certain points of the day. It happens in the afternoon. It was the BBC Overseas service. And they wanted to open it with prayers from the Quran and prayers from the Bible, or just Christian prayers. And so it created a space of public assembly. People would hang around the loudspeakers in some sense. So this sense that we have the radio as a domestic phenomenon, you can control the rest of it, doesn't pertain in this context. I've argued elsewhere that the British sponsored radio to expose Nigerians to ideas coming from other parts of the world in order to dislodge existing cultural understandings and ways of life. This is something that if you do any research in colonialism, like then with the radio, if you're going to put money into a radio station, why not into the healthcare system? Into the healthcare system, why not into building roads? Every administrator has to deal with these sets of choices. So investing in a radio network is an enormous amount of money, and you have to generate rationalities as to why it's necessary. So you have to invest in it in a certain way to make it be radio and not the healthcare system and not the road system and so on and so forth. The logic of the British at this point shares assumptions with emerging modernisation and media theory. It shares a lot of assumption with modernisation theory without having read that literature because it's prior to it. And it shares a lot of assumptions with the Francaise school, having not read that literature. But the idea is that media work to reshape people's sensibilities. They work upon the body. And in the context of radio, they will expose people. Now, in the language of modernisation, certainly that we learn as the passing of traditional society, the problem was the fatalism of Islamic ways of life. The traditional people were caught in a way of life they couldn't get out of. They couldn't foresee other possibilities in the world. They were trapped. The world was the way it was, God had made it that way, and that was it. What radio allows you to do is reflexively understand your position in terms of other people in the world. It creates what Lerner calls mobile personalities. Empathy becomes a large part of it, because through the power of empathy, you can identify with other ways of life. Through that act, there's a psychic transformation where you then begin to realize maybe there's other ways of acting. Maybe I don't have to do this. Maybe I can aspire to different things. And for Lerner, it puts you on the long march towards secularization and modern, states. That has obviously proved to be wrong. And certainly I wouldn't argue that the British colonialists thought that would be the end result. But they absolutely were invested in the key idea of displacement, of what Paderai would call in a very different vein, the work of the imagination as a structural fact in the modern world. So through this, what radio does is then dislodge traditional ways of life. So there's an enormous ideological load, and there's a deep media theory that goes into the funding of the radio system. So for both Lerner and for Resident Carroll, who was the resident in charge of this in Nigeria, in Kano anyway, media would be the mechanisms of change and secularization, and they were the mechanisms that could bring these states about. By hearing what was going on elsewhere in the world, in other African nations, other Muslim societies, the belief was that Hausa Muslims could gain the experiential basis to understand competing ways of life. Modernization has been much critiqued, but it confirms how an ideology of development was engineered to be as much a part of the radio as its electric wires and loudspeakers. When that sound moved through the air, touching people, settling into neighborhoods, calling people to listen, driving others away in disgust, so too moved the European fetish we still share that the future is made from technology. The radio came to Nigeria as something European, and like many such machineries, it was greeted that way. People saw in a very clear eye this was a Christian technology, this was a Western technology. In my other work, I looked at the investment the British put into making sure that was the message they took, because the exchange of colonialism, I think one of them, is the exchange of political subjection to technology. You accept our suzerainty, we'll build you roads, we'll build you factories, we'll create railroad networks, we'll create radio systems. And the British, went to enormous lengths to make sure that message was communicated. So people take the message. So in that encounter with technology, it's not an unmediated neutral thing. It's a deeply overdetermined thing. One can see these issues at stake in 1943 in an extraordinary meeting between the British resident of Kano, J.H. Carroll, and the Kano Emir, Abdullahi Bayero, over Carroll's request to install a radio service in Kano. Abdullahi had initially rejected radio outright in the past,